This is Paperback Warrior.
All right, it's time for another episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. I'm your co-host, Eric. I've got my colleague, Tom, coming on in just a moment. Again, this is paperbackwarrior.com, home of a lot of vintage reviews. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and all that jazz. Tom, do you want to beg for money now?
I'm not going to beg for money, but some folks have been asking how the fundraising's been going, and it's been going less than stellar, but we're still in the process of accumulating the money. In our timeline where we are, September is not over, so we'll see how the September fundraising went. If you wish to donate to Paperback Warrior podcast so we can buy some recording equipment, go to the paperbackwarrior.com page, go to the desktop version, not the mobile version. In the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a donate link, and we promise we will put that money right back into the show. Now, Eric, you've been doing some traveling, haven't you, and some buying.
Yes, I went to Dallas, Texas, thankfully on my employer's dime, and because I'm poor and we're running out of money here, I visited Half Price Books. So it's their
the flagship store,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, their flagship store. Read some really great things about it online, saw some cool pictures. So I got to go over there one night. Half Price Books wasn't quite as big as I thought it was going to be. It's just a normal store.
It's about the size of a Barnes and Noble, right?
Yeah, maybe so, but most of it's toys now and records, which I guess is the hottest thing. But they had the normal vintage section. It wasn't a spinner like normal. This one had an actual bookshelf with about 100 books or so, and I got 25 of them. The mystery action section was pretty loaded with the high number series, Bolin, SOB, Death Merchant, Penetrator, and so forth. But I did get a lot of books at Half Price. Books like Henry Kane. I got a couple from a guy named Joe Gores. 3 entries in the Hawk series, which I hear is god awful. The first 4 issues of Mod Squad. Got 2 Hitchcock paperback anthologies, which those are always fun. Got a couple John Evans books, which I hear are pretty good. And I got an early mystery book from Robert Randisi. I was kind of excited to find that. Also got 3 books from a guy named Harold Q. Masur. You ever read him?
No, I have a couple, but I haven't read them yet.
Yeah. So that was my trip to Half Price Books. As my trip sort of finished up, I was on the way to the airport, and I ended up finding a place online that was kind of close to the hotel, and it was originally called Paperbacks Plus. And it was a pretty hot bookstore in the area. I think it's a chain, a little local chain. It apparently got bought by a different set of owners here. It was purchased by a guy named John, and I believe it's his wife, Margetta Tilton. And I had the pleasure of meeting both of them at their store, which is now called Lucky Dog Books. I visited the East Dallas store, and man, Tom, this place was loaded. I could tell when I'd asked Mrs. Tilton if she had any action-adventure books, and she knew exactly what I was looking for and took me right to the room.
Wow.
And some of them don't really understand what you're asking for.
Yeah.
They'll take you to she'll show you Tom Clancy, but she knew what I was looking for. The place was loaded. Mystery had a lot of the Fawcett Gold Medal books that I'm always looking for. Had a really robust Western section. Very nice selection of military fiction. The action-adventure room was just fantastic. And
wait, before you get into what you found, how were the lists? What were the prices? What were they charging for the books? I understand if you walked in with no credit, for example.
I think it was $2 a book.
That's great.
Yeah,
That's
it
really
was
good.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Ended up getting some books from the series Joe Gall, Rat Bastards, Soldier of Fortune, Specialist. 2 to 3 books of a series called Hatch by Don Merritt. Apparently came out in 1987. Has some really cool covers. Bragg, which I think someone was talking about the other day.
Yeah, Bragg's been reprinted by Lee Goldberg's Brash Books.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Got a couple of those. Barry Sadler's The Rescue. He wrote Casca. Some World War II novels. And a lot of, the thing is, there was just a lot of books that I had never seen before. Just series that I had never come across before. And a lot of the World War II stuff that I just never seen before. I got a series called The Force. They had a bunch of assignments, a bunch of Nick Carter's, Boland's, post-apocalyptic one called The Zone.
I've heard good things about The Zone.
Yeah, I was going to buy them.
It's got the tank on the cover.
Yeah, it's
right?
got the tanks.
Yeah.
They had like books 3, 4, and 11, I think, something like that. But I want to start with the first one. I got a Protector book. They had Matt Helm, Jack Higgins, Fawcett Gold Medals, MIA Hunter, and so forth. So they had a lot of a lot of the men's action adventure stuff, but really got into some of the World War II stuff as well. But interesting enough, I was in there shopping and just kind of browsing, and a gentleman walked in, and it was one of those weird things where you make eye contact, and I'm like, do I know you from somewhere? I'm not from Dallas, but he's kind of looking at me, I was looking at him, and he introduced himself. His name is Dave, and he's actually a member of our Facebook Men's Action Adventure group online. He's sort of a newbie. He's been on there about 6 months. Heck of a guy. He showed me around the store.
Total coincidence that a guy, was he familiar with Paperback Warrior?
Yes. He says he reads our reviews all the time.
Wow.
I think he said he listens to the show. And the funny thing was, he knew where I was the night before because I posted photos of my purchase from Half Price Books.
We have one fan. There's a fan out there.
Dave is our super fan. So he shows me around. He's a perfect tour guide. His friend is in the store as well, who concentrates on magazines, and they have a really nice vintage magazine section in the back. But the two of them were extremely nice. But Dave goes above and beyond. He did one of the nicest things anyone's ever done for me. We stack up the books. He's helping me stack books up on the floor, and I can't get these on the plane because it's 25 pounds of books, and it's just not going to happen. So he volunteers to mail these things for me. He'll package them up in a box, and he'll mail them to me without any problems. He's going to take this burden onto himself. But then, Tom, he volunteers to pay for the damn things.
Wait, using what, his store credit or his money?
Yeah, apparently he's got, $300-400 worth of store credit at this place that he's probably never going to use. And so you get half off with your credit. So
I want Dave to go on vacation with me.
Well, he said that this book, it was good, but he was mentioning another book in a bookstore in Denton that's really good, and another bookstore that he was talking about as well. He said it was kind of a
he
must.
sounds like he'd be a great tour guide to just spend a day with, just driving around Dallas.
Yeah, but it was a lot of fun talking to him because he's kind of like I was back in 2014. He's new to all of it.
Yeah.
And so he's asking me random questions about series and stuff like that. So he's kind of picking my brain, and that was a lot of fun. Good. And it kind of reminded me of what I did with you a couple years ago.
Yeah, no, that's so cool.
Yeah.
And it's so nice of Dave to do that for you, because I can imagine as a Paperback Warrior reader and listener, how disappointed he was to find out that you were one of the Paperback Warriors that he met, and not like meeting Ringo Starr and not
right.
John Lennon.
Yeah,
so.
Right, exactly. But it was great, good meeting. But he's a super nice guy. If I head back down to Texas, I'm gonna hook up with him again and have him show me around. But also, I want to plug the store. The store owner, John, I'd met him and his wife, but they were extremely nice, welcomed me back anytime, and said I was the fan of the day.
So it's Lucky Dog Books. Is it in Dallas proper or in a suburb?
It's in East Dallas, near a suburb, because it's where all the the lawyers and attorneys live there with the country club and things like that.
Well, you could Google it. Lucky Dog Books in the greater Dallas area.
There you go.
So on today's show, we're going to have two reviews. Eric is going to review the Trailsman book #1, which is called 7 Wagons West by the house name of John Sharp. And I'm going to review Epitaph for a Tramp by David Markson. But first, we're going to do a feature on adult westerns. And I'm going to be talking about that, and Eric's going to weigh in a little bit. Let's define what we're talking about when we discuss adult westerns. We're really talking about westerns with graphic sex scenes embedded in the action. Not Louis L'Amour, not Zane Grey. There may be a lot of adult, gunplay and action in those things, but there's a very specific subgenre of westerns that was incredibly popular called adult westerns that had graphic sex scenes in them. And if you want to know more about this, and where I'm getting a lot of my information, there was a fantastic fanzine, I guess for lack of a better word, called Hot Lead, L-E-A-D, published by a guy named Justin Marriott. Issue number 3 of Hot Lead, and this is available print on demand, very cheap on Amazon. You got to get it. It's their adult western issue. Selfishly, I like it because I have an article in there. But the more important piece that I'm going to be using as a reference for this discussion today is a feature called Sex and Six Guns by friend of the show and great author Paul Bishop. James Reasoner, who's written more of these books than I'll ever live long enough to read. Now, he makes the case in the article and in discussions that I've had that he considers the first adult Western series to be the Lassiter series by the house named Jack Slade. Paul Bishop says that the first 4 books in the Lassiter series were by W.T. Ballard, and later installments were written by Peter McCurtain, who we've discussed here on the show. Now, I don't think, personally, I disagree with both Paul and James that Lassiter is the first adult Western series because they're really missing the graphic sex that defines it. I think they were definitely, because once McCurtain got involved, they definitely got more violent, and so the Lasseter books were more like the British variety of adult westerns, because the British authors of American westerns, known as the Piccadilly Cowboys, they were dialing up the intense violence in their westerns. British readers did not want to see their cowboys get laid. They wanted to see intense violence and testicular mutilation, like in the Edge series and the Apache series. But the Americans wanted sex. And so in my mind, and I think Paul would probably agree with this, the real beginning of adult westerns was the Slocum series. Slocum is spelled Slocum series, written under the house name Jake Logan. The series started in 1975. It was published by Playboy Press, so readers knew exactly what they were getting when they're buying a Playboy Western. Writers of the Slocum series were supposed to write a 60,000-word book, about 198 pages or so, with 3 graphic sex scenes that had to be in it. It was part of the contract you signed when you were going to write one of these books for a couple grand. Other than the sex scenes, these are pretty standard violent Western novels. Some authors who wrote the Slocum books and went on to some fame include best-selling author Martin Cruz Smith. And if you ever go to one of his book signings, be sure to bring his Slocum book there, because I guess he gets very irritated, and sometimes he'll actually not agree to sign it because he's not proud of this work that he did. An author named Jack Bickham and Shepard Rifkin also wrote Slocum books. Now, the problem with the Slocum series, from my mind, is that they mostly suck. The series lacked any editorial guiding hand to ensure quality control and continuity. There were Slocum books that I read where Slocum is like meeting aliens who landed in flying saucers in the Wild West. One episode, there's rumors. I mean, there's like 400 something of these books. He may have had sex with a horse. I don't know. I don't think the Slocum books are the best, but they're important historically. None of this stopped, my opinion of it, and or the weirdness or the lack of quality control, did not stop Slocum from being tremendously commercially successful. Eventually, it migrated over from Playboy Books to Berkeley Jove, which was a subsidiary of Penguin and Random House. The series went on for 430 episodes. And those are just the regular ones. They also produced double-sized giant editions before the series was canceled in 2014. This is really the launching of a literary juggernaut that kept the Western genre alive during some lean publishing years. And that's what people need to understand before they poo-poo the adult Western books, that Westerns were not selling particularly well in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but the adult Westerns kept the genre alive and kept talented authors who liked writing Western novels in business and put food on their table. So there are 4 big series titles of wildly successful adult Westerns that I think you have to look at as kind of the big 4. We discussed Slocum. That was number 1. The second one would be Trailsman. Trailsman was a series written under the pseudonym of John Sharp. It starred a guy named Sky Fargo. The series was developed, or at least episode 1 and most of the first couple hundred, written by a guy named John Messman, who also wrote the science fiction kind of Sword and Planet Richard Blade books. Anyway, Trailsman started in 1980. It went 398 installments before its cancellation in 2014. We also had giant editions. This guy, Sky Fargo, his thing was he was a trailsman. He was guiding people through the wilderness, getting laid along the way. They were mostly wilderness adventures as opposed to the kind of Westerns I tend to enjoy more, where the gunslinger kind of finds himself in a strange Western town and needs to deal with a situation. After John Messman stopped writing the series, David Robbins of the Wilderness series, he wrote it under the name David Thompson also, and he also wrote the Blade post-apocalyptic series. He ended up taking over a lot of them, but there were tons of authors who wrote the Trailsman books, including Ed Gorman, James Reasoner, and just a whole host of people. I think Stephen Mertz wrote 1 or 2. So real talented people were working on the Trailsman series. The number 3 of the big 4 series was Long Arm by Tabor Evans. Again, Tabor Evans was the house name. The setup on this one was really great, and it lent itself to some fantastic stories. Custis Long, also known as Long Arm, was a deputy U.S. Marshal based in Denver. At the beginning of each book, Long Arm is given an investigative assignment by his boss, the U.S. Marshal, and they end up being kind of crime-fighting mysteries where he's going to some part of the country to deal with an investigative situation. Famous author Lou Cameron wrote many of the books in the series. He also wrote the Bible for the series, kind of telling people what kind of horse, telling the authors how to write in that style. So the Long Arm series had some continuity among them. James Reasoner, who I mentioned earlier, wrote a ton of these, among the best ones I've read. Even Harry Whittington wrote a handful of them, maybe 4 or 5, that are supposed to be real good. I have them, but I haven't read them. A contemporary Western author named Peter Brandvold wrote several really good episodes of Long Arm. And it's just a really good series, mostly thanks to the mystery element. And that one ran until 2015 with 436 installments, including Giants. So these 3 series were all dying out in 2014 and 2015 after just writing an absolute ton of them. The 4th big one is the Gunsmith series by J.R. Roberts, which is a pseudonym for Robert Randisi. They star Clinton Adams, who's sort of a kind of adventurer for hire who finds himself wandering from town to town. The series started in 1982, and it's still going strong with 450 installments. They come out quarterly now. I would say it's the most consistently good series because they're all written by the same author, Randisi. Probably my favorite overall series. They get a bit repetitive if you keep reading them back to back. It's comfort food. You know what you're getting. So I would say these are the 4 of the top tier commercially successful ones. But then when you get into the second tier, you get into the Lone Star series, starring by Wesley Ellis, which had a neat spin on it. The main character was a woman named Jessie Starbuck who went out and had adventures and got laid. And she had a sidekick who was a kung fu guy named Key. I didn't think the Lone Star series was that good. It was a long arm spinoff. The best Lone Star stories are actually Long Arm Giants, where it's a Lone Star long arm crossover. Many of those are written by James Reesner, and you can find an article called The Adult Western Super Friends on paperbackwarrior.com guiding you through some of the best episodes. There was the Spur series, which ran for 45 installments by the house name of Dirk Fletcher, who was the pseudonym for Chet Cunningham, but Chet may have subcontracted out some of those. Spur was a U.S. Secret Service agent who at the time was very concerned with counterfeiting, and so a lot of counterfeiting and treasury work was a part of that. One of my favorite series was a guy named Canyon O'Grady, which was also a spin-off of the Trailsman series written under the house name of John Sharp. Canyon O'Grady was basically the president's agent, like a special agent working for President James Buchanan, who was sent out to do adventures. Most of those were written by Chet Cunningham and Robert Randisi, but book 1 was written by John Messman, was just excellent. For instance, in book number 5, he has to save the life of Abraham Lincoln when he was running for the Senate seat of Stephen Douglas. There's also one that you are more familiar with than I am called the Buckskin series. And I think there were 2 different pseudonyms on that, Roy LeBeau and Kit Dalton. What do you know about that one, Eric?
Yeah, so we talk about, all these heroic Westerns with these heroes that, just get laid and do all the right things. But what's interesting about Buckskin is that he's sort of a bad guy. Buckskin came out in 1984 by Leisure. The series ran 42 entries, and they did 10 giant editions featuring 2 books and 1 volume. Really don't know who wrote the majority of the first 14 books. Fingers point to a guy named Mitchell Smith, but then after that it was the normal guys: Chet Cunningham, Peter McCurtain, David Keller, and so forth. But Buckskin it's funny the way the book starts, the debut. It begins with Buckskin, who's a guy named Frank Leslie. He gets drunk, and he shoots his lover. He just shoots and kills her, and then he rides off into the wilderness because he's ashamed and yada yada yada. The law's after him, so he shoots a horse, which is always frowned upon in westerns. You don't shoot the horse. He beats the living heck out of a teen boy, and then he rapes a woman.
Wow.
Did you hear that last part?
That's not something the hero normally does in a Western. You don't see Louis L'Amour's heroes doing
that. No,
and
get this. In fear that the local deputy's going to arrest him, he sends a lawman back with an envelope of cash to try to let him walk free after raping this woman. Anyway, Buckskin's the guy on the cover selling the books, and he's not such a nice guy. But that's the only one I ever read was just the debut, and I was like, wow, that's kind of interesting.
I may have spaced. Did you mention who wrote these?
Well, we think it was Mitchell Smith that wrote the first 14. I'm not sure who that is.
Yeah.
But then later it was Cunningham and Peter McCurtain and some of the other, even someone named Mary Carr I'm not familiar with.
Interesting.
David Keller and so forth. But yeah, that's really odd.
There was another mid-list series called Doc and Raider by J.D. Hardin. They were Pinkerton agents. They were a really good series I enjoyed. I can't remember the author's name. It was Easy Company. The Easy Company guys was a U.S. Army cavalry unit in the Wild West and had an ensemble cast. So they had the folks who wrote that, and I think Lou Cameron wrote a few, had a great deal of breadth as far as which one of the members of the cavalry are going to star in that particular episode and get laid. The Renegade series was pretty interesting. That was a Lou Cameron series, writing as Ramsey Thorne. They started the hero was named Captain Gringo, and they were basically a porno version of the Fargo novels by John Benteen. Most of them are not westerns per se. They're really Central American adventures about an American adventurer in Central America and the Yucatan Peninsula. There's some shocking sex in that. For example, I mean, he has I don't know how to put this for our delicate audience, backdoor relations with a 13-year-old Mexican woman, like 70 pages into the first book. So this stuff is really, really graphic sex. Some authors did a very good job of making the sex scenes tie in nicely to the novel itself. Others, they were clearly just shoehorned in by the authors to meet their contractual obligation. There were tons and tons of series titles that just failed to catch fire at all. In Paul Bishop's article, he lists 62 series in the adult Western genre, and I bet you there were others that he didn't catch. In fact, Paul Bishop's very first book that he ever sold was part of the Diamondback series of adult Westerns, written under the name Pike Bishop. Anyway, so you should definitely check out this Hot Lead on Amazon, and I would recommend checking out an adult Western. We review several of them on our Paperback Warrior site, and so you should check that out. I think if you're a skeptic about Westerns, you're like, I don't think I like Westerns, this is kind of a nice way to dive in, because the books are easy, quick reading. They're really the Mac Bolan of Westerns. They're formulaic, they're fun, they're easy reads. There's sex scenes which you can either enjoy or skip, whether you see that as a feature or a bug. But I don't know. I think it's definitely a genre that's worth thinking about, because there's thousands and thousands of books that fall into this genre. So that's all I got. Why don't I throw it over to you for a book review?
Yeah, and I've got a little bit of a tidbit on what you just talked about.
Yeah.
In Brash Books' reprints of the Hardman novels, in a couple of them, they've got a really cool intro by Joe R. Lansdale, a really famous author, really well respected. And it says in here, I want to quote, an agent once told me I was wasting my time writing other things, and I could be part of this big stable he had writing adult Westerns. Although I had nothing against sexy Westerns, which may in fact have been pioneered as a true branch of the Western genre by a very good writer named Brian Garfield and his novel Sliphammer, which 1970.
Okay, I have Sliphammer, yeah.
And so do you think that, was that cited in any of your research?
No, it was not. I'm not sure. I would need to take a look at Hot Lead, but I don't, again, the Paul Bishop's article in the adult Western genre was really about series titles, about having people come back for more. Gotcha. There may have been standalone Westerns that had sex, or just straight up porno books that took place in the Wild West. I haven't read Sliphammer, but I like Brian Garfield.
I do too, and it basically Lansdale compares writing these adult Westerns, which he apparently, when he was really poor and destitute, he was thought about doing it. And apparently he did write some, but they didn't get published. But he compares it to wearing a tux to a tractor pull.
That's funny. Anyway, so regarding adult Westerns, you actually read the first book in the Trailsman series. What do you think?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I wanted to start with the very first one. John Messman is the author of the first 200 installments, I believe, of the series. He had a really busy schedule in the 70s. John Messman wrote a lot of vigilante stuff: Killmaster, Revenger, Handyman. He did a series called Hotline. But I think by the time 1980 rolled around, he was really sort of burned out on espionage and vigilante stuff. So it makes sense that he would write a Western series. So beginning with Seven Wagons West, Messman wrote the first 200 installments of the series for Signet under the house name of John Sharp. And crazy, that's really only half the series. The Trailsman ran through 397 novels from 1980 through 2014. And, of course, as you've talked about in prior episodes, the last half were written by a rotating sort of blend of authors that we've talked about in the past. But Seven Wagons West is the debut, and it introduces the hero. His name is Sky Fargo. He's really the Trailsman. He's just a frontier guy who rides an unnamed horse, and he fires a Remington 44, and he escorts clients on the winding trails of the untamed West. But the character's backstory is fairly simple. And I think I'd asked you, you've read some Trailsman, you didn't really realize that there was sort of a backstory to his character, right? That there was
No, again, the ones I read were later installments, and
Okay.
and so I never really got into the kind of the mythology of Sky Fargo. He was just kind of riding and screwing a lot in the ones I read.
Well, I think the backstory is pretty simple. His father was a road agent for Wells Fargo, which is why he took the name Fargo. And while he was away as a kid, his parents and his kid brother were murdered by 3 bank robbers. And so the whole time of the series, apparently he's scouring the West trying to find these guys that killed his family. But I don't know if that's ever really touched upon a whole lot. But like you said, in the first installment, he's basically hired by a reverend and his wife to escort them into Wisconsin territory to find a silver mine. And he's being paid, obviously, but it sounds like he's just really being paid with women. There's 3... women on the wagon train that he finds time to pork along the way several times, and he even porks the Reverend's wife of all things.
Shame on him.
Sacrilege. But he gets to the mine, and then there's a shootout because he's the gunman, and he fights the bad guys and so forth. But it was entertaining. I don't know if all these books run the same way as just getting from point A to point B. And
well, again, that's the Trailsman thing. The Trailsman's going to help escort you from point A to point B to keep you from getting killed on the road by bad guys or Indians. Whereas, Long Arm and Gunsmith are blowing into a small town and dealing with the situation there, usually some level of lawlessness. So it depends what you like. Some people like the frontier stories, in which case Trailsman's the thing. Some people like the small western town series with the saloon and the whorehouse and all that, in which case Gunsmith's probably going to be your best bet.
Yeah, I guess at 160 pages, the thing flew by and it was very easy to read.
Would you recommend it?
Yeah, I would probably recommend it. Maybe just a few titles here and there. Maybe I'd like if any readers out there have specific titles that they want to recommend, I would definitely entertain that. You can send it to paperbackwarrior@yahoo.com or just post it on the Facebook groups on our page as well. But I'd be curious to see what they think is maybe like a top 10.
Yeah, there was when David Robbins took over. David Robbins is also a very credible horror author, wrote a lot of horror novels. He wrote some pretty scary Trailsman books, one of which is reviewed on paperbackwarrior.com. For the life of me, I can't remember what it is. Yeah. But we had another guy who was writing for Snowden. And he was a very good writer. He wrote for us for about less than a year. I recommended my favorite Trailsman to him, and he wrote the review of it. And it was like a horror novel where Sky Fargo finds himself in a ghost town, and just like scary stuff is happening. It ended up being a bit of a weird menace situation. It wasn't truly, there was nothing supernatural going on. But I remember reading this and having sort of that sinking feeling you get when you're reading a really good Stephen King novel, that this is kind of actually scary. And so check that out at paperbackwarrior.com. If you click on the Trailsman link, you'll see it immediately. I think there's only 2 Trailsman books that we reviewed, the number 1 and that other scary one written by David Robbins. And I asked David Robbins about it, and he said that every now and then, he wrote so many of these things, he threw a couple scary ones in there. So that was sort of fun.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right, back to you for the last review.
Okay, good. So let's switch gears because you've heard plenty about adult westerns this time. Let's go to some hard-boiled crime. The book I want to review now is Epitaph for a Tramp by David Markson. The book was also released as Fannin, Fannin, which is the character's name, by David Markson. So David Markson died in 2010. He was like this highly respected Greenwich Village literary figure who wrote experimental stuff. When he was first getting his start as a writer, he wrote 2 hard-boiled noir paper books for Dell, starring a private investigator named Harry Fannin. The first novel, and the one I'm reviewing today, is Epitaph for a Tramp from 1959. And the sequel was Epitaph for a Deadbeat, written in 1961, that I've not read yet. So the books have been reprinted several times and even compiled together. In fact, it's not available on Kindle legally, but it is available. But there is a double paperback that I ordered just because I wanted to have these in my collection as well, even though I had one of the old ones. Anyway, so Epitaph for a Tramp, which was also released as Fannin for a 1974 Unibook reprint, is narrated by Fannin, who's a former University of Michigan halfback, former newspaperman, former U.S. Army soldier, and a current private detective. He's living in like the sweaty, lonely existence in Manhattan in a flea bag apartment with his books. So one night he can't get to sleep because he's hot and he's lonely. It's 3:30 in the morning, and and his door buzzer goes off. The uninvited guest is his estranged ex-wife, Kathy, who he hasn't seen in a year. She gets up the stairs to his apartment and collapses into his arms and dies moments later from a stab wound to her chest. And so now he's got a murder to solve. He doesn't have a client, no one's paying him, but he's got a murder to solve. We quickly learn that Kathy was no angel during the message. She was a tramp, and the tramp that you heard in the paperback book title. I'm not going to spoil details, but we get a flashback detailing the trajectory of the marriage between Fannin and Kathy, and that was an amazing story unto itself. And so we want to know more about this girl, and Fannin wants to know the facts as to how she, what became of her after they split up and why she died. Now, Fannin's not like a normal hard-boiled private eye. He's a real thinking man's private eye, and that's probably because David Markson was a real literary type of guy. Fannin makes very funny wisecracks, kind of like the Shel Scott series, and lots of genre tough guy talk like Mike Hammer. But he's also smart, and he drops a lot of literary references along the way, like T.S. Eliot and Dashiell Hammett. Some of the characters that Fannin encounters are drawn with rough stereotypes that wouldn't fit well today. But I actually like that because it's just such an interesting time capsule, the way that people thought of minorities or gay people and stuff like that back in the 50s and 60s. It's a violent read, man. I mean, a character gets tied to a chair and burned with a lit cigarette. There's some graphic beatings, but it's just this fantastic novel about this private eye trying to figure out who killed his whore of a wife. And I mean, the author's clearly taking the template of Mickey Spillane's Mike Hammer series, but then he turns the volume up to 11 with this fantastic twist ending and these violent scenes. It's a mystery, but it's also a vendetta story because he wants to get even with the guy who killed his ex-wife. I have to say, we're going to do an end-of-the-year episode in December where we talk about the best books we read this year. And I have to say, count on this novel being there. It's one of the finest books I've read this year. Highly recommended. It's an absolute must-read, and I just can't wait to read the sequel. A fantastic book. And the book, again, is called Epitaph for a Tramp, also known as Fannin, by David Markson, Markson. Promise you guys, you will love this book.
And you set this up perfectly because later this month we've got a slew of reviews coming. We're only halfway through the month at this point, but we've got a lot coming, and we're going to have what Tom considers possibly the worst book he's ever read.
Oh man, don't even spoil it.
I'm not going
to. Don't tell him what it is. This book is such a piece of garbage. I'm going to go off on such a rant in our next couple episodes about this book, about it. Just absolute dog crap this book was. Like a new Hall of Shame high. It was oh god, I'm fuming, just my blood pressure's rising just thinking about this novel.
All right, settle down. All right, we've got some really good stuff that headed your way. Guys like Robert B. Parker, Harry Whittington, Jack Higgins, I know Higgins Fest, Peter O'Donnell, Lester Dent, Frank Kane, even a Carter Brown thrown in there too. So we got some really great stuff coming up for the rest of the month. So definitely stay tuned. That's all I have. We're out of time.
I'm going to Austin, Texas for a film festival. They got a couple of half-price books and a used bookstore affiliated with the public library. If I find anything good, I'll tell you about it next week.
All right, sounds great. We'll see you next time. Thanks.
All right, be cool.
Bye-bye now.